I should have known better than to wear the diamond bracelet to his charity gala. Should have realized that nothing escapes Dante Salvatore's notice, especially not something that glitters and catches the light the way my grandmother's antique bracelet did as I reached for a champagne flute from the passing waiter's tray. The moment his obsidian eyes locked onto the delicate chain of diamonds encircling my wrist, I felt the shift in the air, that electric charge that always preceded his storms, and the entire ballroom seemed to freeze in anticipation of what was coming next, as if every person in their designer gowns and tailored tuxedos instinctively understood that they were about to witness something dangerous unfold. He had been across the room just seconds before, surrounded by politicians and business moguls who hung on his every word, men who controlled millions but still bent their knees to Dante's will. And I had been admiring the way he commanded that space with nothing more than his presence, the way his broad shoulders filled out that custom Armani suit in midnight black, the way his dark hair was styled with just enough disorder to make you want to run your fingers through it and restore some semblance of order. But then his gaze had drifted from the conversation, scanning the crowd with that predatory awareness that never truly shut off. And when those dark eyes found me standing near the marble columns that lined the gallery, something in his expression shifted from polite engagement to laser-focused intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. He crossed the marble floor with the kind of grace that shouldn't belong to a man of his size and power, each step measured and deliberate, and the crowd parted for him without conscious thought, an instinctive response to the apex predator moving through their midst. I watched him approach with my heart hammering against my ribs, trying to read the expression on that devastatingly handsome face, those sharp cheekbones and strong jaw that could have been carved from granite, those full lips that I knew could be soft and demanding in equal measure. And I saw something there that made my stomach drop with a mixture of fear and anticipation that had become far too familiar in the 3 months since this undefined, complicated thing between us had begun. His hand closed around my wrist like a vice, not hard enough to hurt, but firm enough that I couldn't have pulled away even if I'd wanted to. And the heat of his palm against my skin sent electricity racing up my arm, despite the warning bells clanging in my head. "Who bought you that bracelet, Mira?" His voice was velvet wrapped around steel, smooth and cultured on the surface, but with an undercurrent of something sharp and dangerous that most people never heard unless they'd crossed him. And I felt every head in the room turn away in unison, because these people, the elite of the city's social scene, they knew better than to witness what came next when Dante Salvatore's control began to slip. "Dante, you're making a scene," I whispered, hyper-aware of the orchestra still playing Vivaldi in the background, of the crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light across the room, of the priceless artwork adorning the walls of this gallery that his family owned, along with half the city and most of its darkest secrets. My voice came out steadier than I felt, which was a small miracle considering the way my pulse was racing beneath his fingers, considering the way those dark eyes were boring into mine with an intensity that made me feel stripped bare and exposed despite the elegant emerald gown I wore, the one he'd had delivered to my apartment 3 days ago, with a note that simply said, "Wear this tonight." "I don't give a damn about the scene," he said, his accent thickening the way it always did when his emotions ran high, that slight Italian inflection that turned his words into something that felt like a caress and a threat all at once. "I asked you a question, and I expect an answer, because every person in this room knows you belong to me, knows that you don't accept gifts from other men, and yet here you are wearing diamonds that I didn't give you, flaunting them where everyone can see." His thumb stroked over my racing pulse point, a gesture that might have seemed tender, if not for the steel in his voice, if not for the way his jaw clenched with barely restrained fury that I could feel radiating off him in waves. The rational part of my brain, the part that had earned me a master's degree in art history and a position as lead acquisitions specialist at Salvatore Fine Arts, despite my relatively young age of 26, knew that I should be angry at his presumption, at the way he was treating me like property in front of the city's most influential people. But there was another part of me, a part I didn't fully understand or trust, that responded to the raw possessiveness in his voice, to the way his eyes darkened with something that looked like genuine fear beneath the anger, as if the sight of that bracelet on my wrist had shaken something fundamental in his carefully constructed world. "It belonged to my grandmother," I told him, keeping my voice low, and even despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins, despite the way I could feel hundreds of eyes trying not to look at us, while simultaneously straining to hear every word of this exchange. "She left it to me when she passed away 5 years ago, and I wore it tonight because it makes me feel close to her, not because some man bought it for me, not because I'm trying to send you some kind of message or play games with your head." The words came out with more bite than I'd intended, my own temper starting to flare in response to his accusation. Because how dare he assume? How dare he think so little of me after everything we'd been through in these past 3 months? Something flickered across his face, an emotion too quick for me to name before his expression hardened again into that mask of controlled fury that he showed the world when he needed to remind people why his family had ruled this city's underworld for 3 generations. "We're leaving," he said. Not a request, but a command. And before I could protest, he was already guiding me through the crowd, with his hand still wrapped around my wrist, leading me past the sculptures and paintings that I had personally acquired for this collection, past the champagne fountains and elaborate floral arrangements that had cost more than most people made in a year, toward the private corridor that led to the gallery's back offices, where he conducted the business that had nothing to do with art and everything to do with the empire he'd inherited at the age of 28, when his father had been gunned down in a restaurant downtown. I stumbled slightly in my 4-inch heels, trying to keep pace with his longer strides, and immediately his other hand came to steady me at the small of my back, that automatic protective instinct that coexisted so strangely with his controlling nature, the duality that defined everything about Dante Salvatore. We reached one of the private viewing rooms, the kind reserved for VIP clients who wanted to examine potential acquisitions away from prying eyes, and he pulled me inside before closing and locking the door behind us, with a finality that made my heart race even faster. The room was smaller than the main gallery, intimate and dimly lit, with velvet-covered walls in deep burgundy and a single spotlight illuminating the antique desk where I sometimes conducted private sales, where I played my role in the legitimate side of his family's business, while trying not to think too hard about what funded the paychecks and the luxury and the lifestyle that had become my reality. Dante released my wrist only to cage me against the desk with his body, his hands planted on either side of my hips, trapping me without actually touching me, and the heat radiating from him in the confined space made it hard to think clearly, made it hard to remember why I should be angry instead of aroused by this display of raw, unfiltered emotion. "Show me," he demanded, his voice dropping to that low register that vibrated through my chest and settled somewhere much lower. And when I just stared at him in confusion, he reached down and carefully, almost reverently, lifted my wrist to eye level. "Show me every detail of this bracelet. Tell me everything about it. Because I need to know, Mira. I need to understand why you would wear something that I didn't give you. Why you would let another man's gift touch your skin, even if that man has been dead for decades." His fingers were gentle now, as they traced the delicate platinum chain, following each diamond's placement with the kind of attention to detail that made him so dangerous in business, that allowed him to spot a lie or a weakness from a mile away. I watched his face as he examined the bracelet, saw the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the way his lips pressed into a thin line, and I realized with a jolt that this wasn't just jealousy or possessiveness or the need to control that seemed hardwired into his DNA. This was fear, raw and visceral, the kind of fear that came from somewhere deep and wounded, from experiences that had taught him that the people you love will betray you, that gifts and gestures mean hidden agendas, that trust is a weakness that gets you killed in the world where he'd been raised. "My grandmother bought it for herself in 1952, I said softly, watching his expression carefully as I spoke, watching the way his fingers continued their exploration of the antique jewelry with an almost obsessive focus. "She was a seamstress in Naples, Saved for 2 years to afford it. Wore it on the day she married my grandfather, and every anniversary after that for 53 years until he died. And then she wore it every day until her own death, because she said it reminded her that she had been loved completely by a good man. My voice cracked slightly on the last words. The memory of my grandmother's stories, of her weathered hands showing me this bracelet and telling me about true love and devotion, about the kind of partnership that survived poverty and war, and the simple wearing down of time. Dante's hands stilled on my wrist, and when he looked up at me, I saw something raw and unguarded in those dark eyes, something that looked like longing, mixed with regret, mixed with a hunger so intense it made my knees weak. "Why didn't you tell me about it before?" he asked, and there was an edge of accusation there, but also genuine confusion, as if he couldn't fathom why I would keep any part of my life separate from what we shared, why I would maintain boundaries when he'd already claimed so much of me. "Because you never asked," I replied, holding his gaze even though every instinct screamed at me to look away, to protect myself from the intensity of this moment. "Because in 3 months of whatever this is between us, you've taken me to your bed, you've shown me off at events, you've made it clear that no other man should dare approach me. But you've never once asked me about my grandmother, about my childhood, about the things that made me who I am before I walked into your world and let you turn everything upside down." The words poured out of me in a rush, all the frustration and confusion and longing that I'd been holding back since this started, since the night he'd cornered me at a gallery opening and looked at me like I was a masterpiece he intended to acquire regardless of the cost. His jaw clenched, and I saw the muscle tick there. Saw the way his control wavered for just a moment before he pulled himself back together with visible effort, that iron discipline reasserting itself even as his eyes betrayed the chaos underneath. "Come to my office tomorrow," he said, stepping back abruptly and leaving me cold despite the warmth of the room, despite the heat that still pulsed between us like a living thing. "Bring everything, every gift you've ever received, every piece of jewelry, every item that has meaning to you, because I need to see it all, need to know the story behind every single thing that touches your skin." He reached up and carefully, almost tenderly, unclasped the bracelet from my wrist, and I gasped at the loss of it, at the feeling of being stripped of something precious. "Dante, you can't just—" I started to protest, reaching for the bracelet, but he held it up and away from me, examining it under the light with the same intensity he'd used to authenticate a painting or evaluate a business deal, and something in his expression made the words die in my throat. "I'm having this appraised and verified," he said, pulling a silk handkerchief from his pocket and wrapping the bracelet with a care that contradicted his harsh words. "I need to know everything about it, need to confirm your story, need to make absolutely certain that this is what you say it is, and not something else entirely, not a gift from someone who thinks they can stake a claim on what belongs to me." He slipped the wrapped bracelet into his inside jacket pocket, right over his heart, and the symbolism of that gesture wasn't lost on me even through my mounting anger and disbelief. "You're being completely unreasonable," I said, my voice rising despite my attempts to maintain composure, despite the knowledge that arguing with Dante Salvatore when he'd made up his mind was like arguing with a force of nature. "That bracelet is mine. It's one of the few things I have left of her, and you have no right to take it. No right to treat me like I'm some kind of criminal just because I wore a piece of jewelry that you didn't personally approve." I was shaking now, a combination of anger and hurt and something else that I didn't want to examine too closely, something that felt dangerously like heartbreak. He moved so quickly that I didn't have time to react, crowding me back against the desk and cupping my face with both hands, forcing me to meet his eyes, to see the storm raging there that matched my own turbulent emotions. "I have every right," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that sent shivers down my spine despite my fury, despite everything. "Because you're mine, Mira Castellano, mine in every way that matters, and in my world that means I protect what's mine, I verify what's mine. I eliminate any threat to what's mine, even if that threat is just a ghost from the past, or a piece of jewelry that shouldn't mean anything but somehow feels like everything. His thumb stroked over my cheekbones, and I could feel the tremor in his hands, could see the war being waged behind those dark eyes, between the need to control and the fear of losing control completely. Then maybe you need to decide what I actually am to you, I said, my voice barely, above a whisper now, all the fight draining out of me as the emotional exhaustion of this confrontation settled into my bones. Because I can't keep doing this, can't keep being yours when you won't even tell me what that means, won't let me in past the walls you've built so high that sometimes I wonder if you even remember what it's like to trust someone, to love someone without turning it into an investigation or a business transaction. The confession hung between us, heavy with implications that I hadn't meant to voice, with truths that I'd been trying to ignore. He stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he stepped back and headed for the door without another word, leaving me standing there with my heart in pieces and my mind reeling from everything that had just happened. But just before he unlocked the door, he turned back, and the look on his face was so raw, so vulnerable, that it stole what little breath I had left in my lungs. "Tomorrow, my office, 10 a.m., he said, and it wasn't a request or a command this time, but something closer to a plea, something that suggested he needed this as much as he wanted it. Bring everything, and I'll tell you exactly what you are to me. I'll show you why I can't stop myself from needing to know every detail, why the thought of any other man's gift on your skin makes me want to burn this entire city to the ground just to prove a point." And then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click that sounded like a promise and a threat all wrapped into one. I slumped against the desk, my legs finally giving out, and touched my now bare wrist where my grandmother's bracelet had been just minutes before, where the ghost of Dante's fingers still lingered on my skin like a brand. Tomorrow I would go to his office, would bring him the evidence he demanded, would step further into this dangerous game we were playing, and I had absolutely no idea if I was walking toward salvation or destruction, toward the answers I needed, or toward a possessive obsession that would consume us both. But as I caught sight of my reflection in the antique mirror hanging on the wall, saw the flush on my cheeks, and the wild look in my eyes, and the way my chest heaved with each breath, I knew with absolute certainty that I wouldn't stay away, couldn't stay away, because Dante Salvatore had already claimed parts of me that I hadn't known existed, and now I needed to know if this consuming fire between us would forge us into something stronger, or burn us both to ashes in the attempt. The bracelet incident had triggered something feral in Dante Salvatore, something primitive and possessive that refused to be caged by the veneer of civilization he wore so carefully in public. And as I stood outside his office at precisely 10 a.m. the following morning, with a designer tote bag filled with the remnants of my life before him, I couldn't decide if I was walking into a confession or an execution. The Salvatore building dominated the financial district like a monument to power, all glass and steel rising 30 stories into the gray morning sky. And somewhere up there on the top floor, behind mahogany doors and walls that had witnessed God knows what kind of deals and decisions and violence, Dante was waiting for me with the patience of a predator, who knew his prey would come willingly into the trap. His assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Elena, who had worked for the family since before Dante was born, and who seemed to know every secret the Salvatores had ever kept, looked up from her desk as I approached and gave me a look that was equal parts sympathy and warning. "He's been here since 6 this morning," she said, her Italian accent thick and musical, and she gestured toward the heavy double doors that led to Dante's private domain. "Hasn't eaten, hasn't taken any calls, just sitting in there waiting for you like a man possessed, and I've worked for this family long enough to know when one of them has gone past the point of reason and into territory that leads to either wedding bells or warfare." She stood and walked to the doors, knocking twice before pushing them open, and I caught the meaningful look she gave me as I passed. something in her expression suggesting that she'd seen this pattern before and knew how it ended. Dante's office was exactly what you'd expect from a man who controlled an empire built on equal parts legitimate business and carefully concealed criminal enterprise, decorated with antique furniture that had probably witnessed more history than any museum piece. Walls lined with first edition books and original artwork that I had authenticated myself. Floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city he ruled from this tower. He stood with his back to the door, hands in the pockets of perfectly tailored charcoal trousers, white shirt rolled up to his elbows revealing tanned forearms corded with muscle. And even from across the room I could feel the tension radiating off him like heat waves rising from summer pavement. "Close the door and lock it," he said without turning around, his voice that same dangerous calm that I'd come to recognize as the warning before the storm. And I did as he asked, because some part of me understood that what was about to happen required absolute privacy, required the kind of vulnerability that neither of us could afford to show the world. "Put the bag on my desk and then sit down in the chair across from it, because we're going to go through every single item you brought. We're going to discuss every gift you've ever received. And we're not leaving this room until I'm satisfied that I know every person who has ever tried to claim a piece of you. Every man who has ever looked at you and thought he had the right to give you something that would make you think of him." He turned then, and the expression on his devastatingly handsome face made my breath catch because it was raw, hunger mixed with barely leashed fury, mixed with something that looked heartbreakingly like desperation. I set the bag down on his massive desk, the leather making a soft thud against the polished wood, and I could feel his eyes tracking my every movement as I sank into the buttery leather chair that probably cost more than my monthly salary. "This is insane," I said, even as I watched him approach the desk with the focused intensity of a man about to interrogate a suspect, even as my traitorous heart hammered with anticipation rather than fear. "You realize that normal relationships don't involve going through your partner's belongings like you're conducting some kind of criminal investigation? That healthy people don't demand an accounting of every gift like you're auditing my entire life? Don't treat simple acts of kindness from friends and family like they're evidence of betrayal or infidelity or whatever it is you think you're going to find in that bag?" He pulled out the first item without responding to my accusation, a silk scarf in deep crimson with gold threading that caught the morning light streaming through the windows. And he laid it out on the desk with the kind of careful precision that suggested he was cataloging evidence rather than examining a simple accessory. "Who gave you this?" he asked, his fingers tracing the delicate pattern woven into the fabric. And I could see the way his jaw clenched as he waited for my answer. Could practically see him running through scenarios in his mind about who this mysterious gift-giver might be and what their relationship to me might mean. "My college roommate, Sophie, bought it for me in Paris when she went there for her honeymoon 6 years ago," I said, watching his face carefully for any sign of what he was thinking, any hint of whether my answer satisfied whatever criteria he was using to judge the acceptability of gifts from my past. "She called me from a street market near the Louvre, completely overwhelmed by how beautiful everything was. And she said she saw this scarf and immediately thought of me because red was my power color, because I'd spent 4 years watching her fall apart over the man she eventually married and holding her hand through every crisis. And she wanted me to have something beautiful from the city of love even though I wasn't there to experience it myself." The memory brought a bittersweet smile to my face, thinking about Sophie and her now husband Mark and the way they'd built a life together in Seattle with their 2 children, thinking about how simple and uncomplicated their love story had been compared to whatever twisted thing was happening between Dante and me. He nodded slowly, filing away this information in whatever mental database he was constructing, and then he carefully folded the scarf and set it aside before reaching into the bag for the next item, a vintage leather-bound copy of Wuthering Heights with gilt-edged pages and my name embossed on the bow inside cover in fading gold script. "And this?" he asked, opening the book and examining the inscription on the first page, his expression darkening as he read words I couldn't see from my position across the desk, words that I already knew by heart, because I'd read them 1,000 times over the years. My high school English teacher, Mr. Peterson, gave it to me when I graduated, I explained, leaning back in the chair and trying to project a calm I didn't feel, trying to ignore the way my pulse raced every time Dante's fingers caressed something that belonged to me, as if he were learning the history of my life through touch and examination. He was 73 years old, had been teaching for 4 decades, and he told me that in all his years of reading student essays, mine was the only analysis of Heathcliff and Catherine's relationship that truly understood the destructive nature of obsessive love, the way it consumes and corrupts everything it touches until there's nothing left but ashes and regret. I paused, letting the irony of that statement hang in the air between us, wondering if Dante would catch the parallel to what we were doing right now, to the way his obsessive need to possess every part of me was consuming us both. Something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or maybe just acknowledgement that my words carried weight beyond their surface meaning. But he said nothing as he set the book aside and continued his methodical examination of my past. There was a pearl necklace that my father had given me for my 21st birthday, before he'd passed away from a heart attack 2 years later, and I watched Dante's expression soften marginally as I told him about my dad, about the way he'd worked 2 jobs to put me through college, about how he'd been so proud when I'd gotten the position at Salvatore Fine Arts, even though he'd died before seeing me actually excel in that role. There were earrings from my best friend Christina, a watch from my aunt, a set of vintage hairpins that I'd bought for myself at an estate sale, and with each item Dante's questioning became more detailed, more probing, as if he were trying to reconstruct my entire history through these physical objects. But then he pulled out something that made his entire body go rigid, a delicate gold chain with a small emerald pendant that caught the light and threw green fire across the surface of his desk, and I knew immediately what he was seeing, knew that this particular piece was going to require more explanation than anything else in the bag. "This is new," he said, and his voice had gone dangerously quiet. That tone he used when someone had crossed a line and was about to face consequences they couldn't begin to imagine. "This is expensive. This is the kind of jewelry a man gives to a woman when he wants to be more than friends, when he thinks he has a chance at something that belongs to someone else. So I'm going to ask you one more time, Mira, and I suggest you think very carefully about your answer before you speak. Who gave you this necklace?" "You did," I said, watching the confusion spread across his face, watching him process my words and try to reconcile them with whatever narrative he'd constructed in his mind. 3 weeks ago, after we had dinner at that restaurant overlooking the harbor, after we spent the night at your penthouse and you fell asleep with your arm around me like you were afraid I'd disappear if you let go, I woke up early and found this on your nightstand with a note that just said "for you." And I've been wearing it under my clothes ever since because I didn't know if it was meant to be a secret or a statement, or if you'd even remember giving it to me in the first place. The confession tumbled out of me in a rush, all the uncertainty and hope and fear that I'd been carrying around for weeks, the weight of not knowing what these gestures meant, what I meant to him beyond the physical attraction and the possessive claiming. He stared at the necklace for a long moment, and I could see the exact instant when memory surfaced, when he recalled the night in question, and the impulse that had driven him to leave that gift. And the expression that crossed his face was so vulnerable, so utterly unguarded, that it made my chest ache with emotions I wasn't ready to name. "I bought it the day after our first night together," he said, his voice rough with an emotion that might have been regret or longing or some complicated mixture of both. "I saw it in a jewelry store window and thought about how it matched your eyes, about how you'd look wearing nothing but that necklace and my fingerprints on your skin, and I bought it without thinking, without questioning the impulse because for the first time in my adult life I wanted to give someone something beautiful, without calculating what I'd get in return, without treating affection like a business transaction that required equivalent exchange." He picked up the necklace and let it pool in his palm, the gold chain catching the light, and I could see his hand trembling slightly as he stared at it. Then why didn't you put it on me yourself? I asked, needing to understand, needing to know why everything with him had to be so complicated. Why he couldn't just give me a gift like a normal man, instead of leaving it like a secret for me to discover and puzzle over. Why didn't you tell me what it meant? Why didn't you say anything about it when you saw me the next day? Why do you make everything into a mystery, or a test, or some kind of challenge that I'm supposed to navigate without a map or instructions? The frustration bled through in my voice. All the accumulated confusion of 3 months spent trying to decode a man who seemed determined to remain an enigma, even as he demanded complete transparency from me. Dante set the necklace down carefully and moved around the desk with predatory grace, pulling me up from the chair and into his arms before I could protest or prepare myself for the onslaught of sensation that always came when he touched me with intention. "Because I'm terrified," he said against my hair, his breath warm on my temple, his arms wrapped around me like iron bands that I had no desire to escape. Because the last woman I loved, the woman I was engaged to marry 5 years ago, wore jewelry from another man for 6 months, before I discovered she was sleeping with Victor Constantine, feeding him information about my family's operations, helping him plan an attack that nearly killed me and did kill 3 of my men, including my best friend Marco, who took a bullet meant for my head. The words came out in a rush, raw and painful, and I felt him shudder against me as he dragged up memories that he'd clearly buried deep and tried to forget. I pulled back just enough to look up at his face, to see the pain etched in every line, to understand finally where this obsessive need to control came from, why the sight of my grandmother's bracelet had triggered such an extreme reaction. "Her name was Valentina," he continued, one hand coming up to cup my face with a gentleness that contradicted the violence in his story. "She was beautiful and cultured and everything a man in my position was supposed to want, and I gave her everything. Trusted her with secrets that could have destroyed my family. Let her into parts of my life that no one else had ever seen. And she used all of it to betray me. Used my love as a weapon to help my enemies. Wore gifts from him while she lay in my bed and pretended to love me back." His thumb traced my cheekbone, and I could see him struggling with whether to continue, whether to show me more of the wounds that had shaped him into the man who now held me. "The bracelet she wore," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "It was platinum and diamonds, almost identical to your grandmother's, and she told me it was a family heirloom from her dead mother. Wore it every day like a symbol of her devotion to family and tradition. And I believed her because I wanted to believe her, because I was young and stupid and thought that love meant trust without verification, that you could give someone your heart and not worry about them crushing it just to prove they could." He released me abruptly and turned away, running both hands through his dark hair in a gesture of frustration that I'd seen before, when he was fighting against emotions he didn't know how to process, when the carefully constructed walls around his heart threatened to crumble under the weight of what he was feeling. After I found out about her betrayal, after I dealt with Victor's attempt on my life and cleaned up the mess she'd helped create, I had the bracelet examined by a jeweler who specialized in estate pieces, he continued, his back still to me, his shoulders rigid with tension that I wanted to ease but didn't know how. Turned out it wasn't an heirloom at all, but a commissioned piece, something Victor had made for her as a symbol of their real relationship. Something she wore every day as a secret fuck you to me and my family while she played the role of devoted fiancée. And I was too blinded by what I thought was love to see the truth that was literally dangling from her wrist. He turned back to face me, and the look in his eyes was pure devastation, mixed with barely controlled rage at the memory, at the humiliation of being played so completely by someone he'd trusted. I understood then, understood the interrogations and the possessiveness and the need to verify every story, every gift, every piece of my history, because in his world trust had consequences measured in blood and betrayal, because love had been weaponized against him in the cruelest possible way, because he'd learned that the cost of letting someone in could be measured in lives lost and empires threatened. "So when you saw my bracelet last night," I said slowly, pieces clicking into place, "you didn't just see jewelry from an unknown source, you saw Valentina's bracelet. You saw betrayal and lies and the possibility that I might be doing to you what she did, playing you while I belonged to someone else." "Yes," he said simply, the admission raw and honest in a way that Dante rarely allowed himself to be. And he crossed back to the desk to pick up my grandmother's bracelet, which he'd apparently had cleaned and appraised overnight, just as he'd promised. I had 3 different jewelers examine this, verify its age and provenance, confirm that it's exactly what you said it was. A piece from 1952, purchased in Naples, worn by a woman named Rosa Castellano for over 5 decades, he said, holding it out to me like an offering, like an apology wrapped in platinum and diamonds. I know it was excessive, I know it was probably insulting, I know it demonstrated a level of distrust that no relationship can survive long term. But I needed to know. Needed to be absolutely certain that you were telling me the truth. That this wasn't history, repeating itself in some cosmic joke designed to prove that I'm incapable of recognizing genuine affection when it's offered. I took the bracelet from him, our fingers brushing in the exchange, and I felt that familiar electricity arc between us, even through the heavy emotional weight of everything he'd just revealed. "What did you learn from examining all of this?" I asked, gesturing to the items spread across his desk, to the physical representation of my life before him, to the gifts and treasures that meant something to me independent of his world and his money and his complicated darkness. "Did you find what you were looking for? Did you uncover some secret betrayal? Or did you just confirm that I'm exactly who I've always claimed to be? A woman who had a life before you crashed into it and turned everything sideways?" He moved closer, crowding into my space in that way he had that made me feel simultaneously threatened and cherished, his hands coming up to frame my face with a gentleness that always surprised me given the violence I knew he was capable of when circumstances required it. "I learned that you've been loved by good people who saw your worth and wanted to give you beautiful things without expecting anything in return," he said, his dark eyes searching mine with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "I learned that every person who has ever given you a gift did so out of genuine affection or familial love or friendship, that there's not a single item in that bag that suggests betrayal or divided loyalty or anything that should threaten what we have together. And I learned that my paranoia and my past are poison that I keep injecting into something that could be good and pure if I'd just let it exist without constantly testing it for toxins." "And what are you going to do with that information?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, because this felt like a turning point, like we were standing on the edge of something that would either solidify what we were building or shatter it beyond repair. "Are you going to trust me now? Are you going to stop treating every interaction I have with the world as a potential threat? Or are you going to keep interrogating me about every gift, and every friendship, and every part of my life that exists independent of you, until I can't breathe anymore under the weight of your suspicion?" Instead of answering with words, he pulled me against him and kissed me with a desperation that spoke of apologies, and promises, and fears that ran so deep they'd probably never be fully excavated. And I kissed him back. Because despite everything, despite the controlling behavior, and the invasive questions and the way he'd taken my grandmother's bracelet without permission, I understood him now in a way I hadn't before, understood that his darkness came from wounds that had never properly healed, that his possessiveness was just fear wearing a different mask. When he finally pulled back, we were both breathing hard, and he rested his forehead against mine in a gesture of intimacy that somehow felt more vulnerable than anything else we'd shared. "I'm going to try," he said, and the honesty in those 3 words meant more than any elaborate declaration could have. "I'm going to try to trust you, try to believe that you're different from her, try to stop seeing ghosts in every shadow and threats in every gift. But you need to understand, Mira, that this doesn't come naturally to me. That everything in my world has taught me that trust is a luxury I can't afford. That letting my guard down is an invitation to get stabbed in the back, by the people I love most. He paused, his hand sliding down to grip my waist like he was afraid I might disappear if he didn't hold on tight enough. But I'm also going to ask you for something in return. Something that might seem unreasonable, but that I need if we're going to make this work, if we're going to move past this constant cycle of suspicion and reassurance. What do you need? I asked, already knowing that whatever he was about to request would probably cross some boundary, would probably require me to give up more of my independence or privacy or autonomy, but also knowing that I was going to seriously consider it anyway, because walking away from Dante Salvatore was starting to feel impossible, even when staying meant navigating minefields of his trauma and trust issues. He released me and walked back to his desk, pulling out a small leather notebook from the top drawer, along with an expensive fountain pen, and he held them out to me with an expression that was equal parts hopeful and resigned to rejection. "I want you to write down everything," he said, and when I started to protest, he held up one hand to forestall my objection. Not for me to read, not for me to examine or interrogate or use as evidence in some investigation into your loyalty, but for you to have, for you to keep as a record of your life before us, of all the people who loved you and the gifts they gave and the memories attached to each one, because I'm realizing that in my need to verify your past, I've been inadvertently asking you to defend it, to justify the fact that you had relationships and friendships and a full life before I came along and tried to own every piece of you. I took the notebook, running my fingers over the supple leather cover, trying to understand what he was really asking for here, what this gesture meant in the context of everything else that had happened. "And what will you do with this information once I've written it down?" I asked, needing to know his endgame, needing to understand if this was genuine progress or just another manifestation of his need to control and catalog every aspect of my existence. "Nothing," he said, and the simplicity of that answer shocked me more than any elaborate explanation could have. "It's for you, for your peace of mind, so that when I inevitably have another moment of paranoia or jealousy or fear that you're going to turn out like she did, you can show me that book and remind me that you've always been honest, that you've never hidden anything from me except to protect your own privacy and dignity, that the life you lived before me was full of genuine love and connection that has nothing to do with betrayal or deception." He paused, and I could see the vulnerability in his expression, the way he was offering me something that resembled trust even if it wasn't quite there yet. "And maybe, if I'm very lucky and you're incredibly patient, eventually I'll be able to look at a gift someone gives you, or a bracelet you wear, or a friendship you maintain without immediately assuming the worst, without letting Valentina's ghost poison everything good that's trying to grow between us." I stood there holding the notebook, processing everything that had happened in the past 24 hours, trying to reconcile the man who had dragged me out of a gala and demanded to interrogate my jewelry with the man who was now offering me a way to document my history, independent of his scrutiny. And I realized that Dante Salvatore was the most complicated, contradictory, infuriating person I'd ever met, and also somehow the only person I wanted despite all the very valid reasons I should run as fast and far as I could in the opposite direction. "This is insane," I said again, but this time there was less accusation in my voice and more resignation, more acceptance of the fact that nothing about us was ever going to be simple or straightforward, or anything resembling what normal people would consider a healthy relationship. "Completely insane," he agreed, and the ghost of a smile played at the corners of his mouth, the first genuine lightness I'd seen from him since this whole situation had started. "But I find myself not particularly interested in sane or reasonable when it comes to you, Mira Castellano, which is either the first sign that I'm finally healing from what Valentina did to me, or the clearest indication that I'm about to make all the same mistakes again with someone who will eventually realize that loving me requires accepting a level of damage that most people aren't willing to deal with." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, his touch gentle despite the darkness in his words, despite the warning implicit in what he'd just said. "There's something else I need to tell you," he said, and the shift in his tone made my stomach drop with anticipation, with the knowledge that whatever came next was going to change things between us, in ways I couldn't yet predict. The reason I reacted so strongly to your bracelet, the reason I can't seem to stop myself from interrogating every aspect of your life, isn't just about Valentina and what she did, though that's certainly part of it. There's another element to this that I haven't told you yet. Something that happened 3 weeks ago that's been driving me crazy with paranoia and possessiveness, and the overwhelming need to make absolutely certain that you're loyal to me and only me. Because the consequences of being wrong about you aren't just personal heartbreak or emotional devastation. They're potentially catastrophic in ways that could get both of us killed. He paused, his expression darkening with whatever he was about to reveal, and I felt my heart start to race with genuine fear for the first time since this conversation had started. Because the look on his face suggested that we were about to venture into territory far more dangerous than jealousy, or trust issues, or even past betrayals. I thought the interrogations would stop after the bracelet incident. Thought that Dante's confession about Valentina and his promise to try trusting me meant we'd turned some kind of corner in this twisted relationship we were building. But I was spectacularly, dangerously wrong about what would happen next. Because if anything, his obsession intensified over the following days, transformed from jealous interrogation into something that looked almost like devotion on the surface but carried undercurrents of possession so deep and consuming that I found myself drowning in the attention, even as part of me thrilled at being the focus of such intense, unwavering fixation. The morning after our conversation in his office, I woke up to find a security detail waiting outside my apartment building. 2 broad-shouldered men in expensive suits, who introduced themselves as Marco and Stefano, and explained with apologetic expressions that Mr. Salvatore had assigned them to ensure my safety during my daily routines, which was his way of saying that I would now be followed everywhere I went, watched and monitored and protected in ways that felt more like surveillance than genuine concern for my well-being. I called him immediately, my hands shaking with fury as I pressed his number and waited through 2 rings before his dark voice answered with a warmth that suggested he'd been expecting this reaction. "Before you start yelling at me about invasion of privacy and controlling behavior," he said, cutting off my prepared tirade before I could launch into it, "I need you to understand that the threat I mentioned yesterday is very real, very serious, and very specifically targeted at anyone I care about. Which means you're now on a list of potential targets for people who want to hurt me through the most effective means possible. And I would rather have you angry at me for being overprotective than dead in an alley somewhere because I was too concerned with respecting your independence to keep you safe from men who wouldn't hesitate to use you as leverage against me." His words came out in that particular tone he used when he wasn't negotiating or asking permission, but simply stating facts that I needed to accept. And the underlying fear in his voice, barely perceptible beneath the authoritative delivery, made my anger falter even as my rational mind screamed that this was exactly the kind of escalation that should send me running. "What threat?" I demanded, lowering my voice because I was standing on the street outside my building and the security detail was definitely within earshot, probably reporting every word of this conversation back to Dante even as we spoke. "What aren't you telling me about what happened 3 weeks ago? What kind of danger am I supposedly in that requires 2 armed guards following me to the coffee shop and the dry cleaners and everywhere else I need to go throughout my day?" I could hear him take a deep breath on the other end of the line, could practically see him in my mind's eye running his hand through that dark hair in the gesture of frustration I'd come to recognize. Could imagine him standing in his office staring out at the city, while he decided how much truth to give me, and how much to withhold for what he would call my own protection. "The Constantine family has made it known through certain channels that they're interested in evening old scores," he said finally, his voice dropping to that dangerous register that made my spine straighten with instinctive wariness, with the recognition that I was hearing Dante in his full Mafia boss capacity, rather than the complicated, damaged man who kissed me like I was oxygen, and he was drowning. "Victor survived the fallout from Valentina's betrayal, went to ground in Eastern Europe for a few years, rebuilt his organization with backing from some very dangerous people in Moscow, and now he's back in the city making moves to reclaim territory that my family has controlled for decades. And his particular brand of warfare has always involved going after the families of his enemies, making examples of the people we care about to prove that no one is untouchable, that love is just another weakness to exploit. The casual way he delivered this horrifying information, as if he were discussing stock portfolios or art acquisitions rather than potential kidnapping and murder, reminded me viscerally that Dante existed in a world where violence was currency, and human life was just another bargaining chip in games of power and revenge. I felt my knees go weak with the implications of what he was saying, with the sudden realization that wearing Dante's emerald necklace and sleeping in his bed and falling for his particular brand of damaged intensity had painted a target on my back that I'd never consciously agreed to carry. So the security detail isn't about you being possessive and controlling, I said slowly, processing the information and trying to reconcile my anger at being followed with the very real possibility that Dante's paranoia might be entirely justified this time. It's about you trying to keep me alive because getting involved with you has made me a liability, has put me in the crosshairs of people who would hurt me just to prove they can hurt you. And you didn't think to mention this rather significant detail before you started claiming me as yours in front of everyone who matters in your world. Would it have changed anything if I had told you? He asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice beneath the tension, as if he really wanted to know whether I would have walked away if I'd understood the true cost of being with him, if I'd known that this thing between us came with the potential for violence and danger that extended far beyond emotional complexity and trust issues. Would you have chosen differently if I'd laid out all the risks on our first night together, explained that falling for me meant accepting a security detail, and looking over your shoulder, and understanding that there are people in this city who would celebrate your death simply because it would make me suffer? Or would you have kissed me anyway and dealt with the consequences as they came, the way you're dealing with them right now? The question hung between us, weighted with implications about what we were to each other, about whether this was just physical attraction and convenient companionship or something deeper that justified the risks we were taking. And I found myself unable to answer honestly because I genuinely didn't know what I would have chosen if I'd had complete information from the beginning. I need to think about this, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper, and I could hear him exhale sharply on the other end of the line, could sense his disappointment even through the phone, could feel the distance opening between us even as I acknowledged the necessity of processing what he'd just told me. I need to understand what it means to be with you, what I'm really signing up for beyond the jealousy and the interrogations and the incredible sex, because this is my life we're talking about. These are my choices that will determine whether I end up as collateral damage in a war that started before I even knew you existed. Take all the time you need, he said. But there was resignation in his voice, an expectation of rejection that made my heart ache despite my very valid concerns about self-preservation and rational decision-making. The security stays regardless of what you decide about us, because whether or not you continue this relationship, Victor already knows you matter to me, already sees you as a potential target, and I won't risk your safety just because you're angry about the loss of privacy or independence. Won't let you become another casualty of my family's endless cycle of violence and revenge, even if that means you hate me for being overprotective. He paused, and I could hear voices in the background, someone asking him a question in rapid Italian that I couldn't quite make out. Could sense him shifting back into business mode even as this personal crisis remained unresolved between us. I have to go handle something, but Marco and Stefano will stay with you. We'll keep you safe even if you're furious about their presence, and when you're ready to talk about this properly, about what it means for us and what you need from me to feel secure in this relationship, I'll be here waiting to have that conversation regardless of how long it takes you to get there. The call ended before I could respond, leaving me standing on the sidewalk with my phone in my hand and 2 security guards flanking me at a respectful distance. And I realized with a mixture of fear and something that felt dangerously like anticipation that my life had fundamentally changed in ways I was only beginning to understand, that I'd crossed some invisible threshold that couldn't be uncrossed regardless of whether I chose to continue down this path with Dante, or tried to extricate myself from the dangerous world he inhabited. The next few days passed in a blur of carefully monitored routine, with Marco and Stefano becoming fixtures in my daily existence, silent shadows who drove me to work and waited outside my apartment and checked every restaurant before I entered for potential threats that I couldn't see, but that they'd been trained to anticipate. And I found myself oddly comforted by their presence even as I resented the necessity of it, even as I struggled with the knowledge that this was my reality now, whether I wanted it or not. Dante kept his distance during this time, giving me the space I'd asked for, but making his presence felt in other ways. In the fresh flowers that appeared in my office every morning, with notes that simply said things like, "Thinking of you," or "Miss the sound of your voice." In the way my favorite coffee order appeared on my desk precisely when I needed the caffeine boost most. In the small gestures that demonstrated attention and care even from across the city. But then, something happened that shattered the tentative equilibrium we'd established, something that forced the situation to its crisis point, and made me realize that neutrality wasn't an option anymore, that I had to either commit fully to this dangerous relationship or end it completely before someone got hurt in ways that couldn't be repaired. I was at the auction house examining a newly acquired collection of Renaissance drawings when my colleague Thomas approached with an enormous bouquet of white roses, his expression friendly and completely oblivious to the catastrophic chain of events he was about to trigger. "These just arrived for you," he said, setting the elaborate arrangement on my desk with a smile that suggested he thought this was romantic rather than potentially life-threatening. And I felt my stomach drop as I reached for the card with trembling fingers, already knowing somehow that these flowers weren't from Dante, that they represented exactly the kind of attention from another man that would set off every alarm bell in his paranoid, possessive mind. The card was simple, unsigned, with just a few words printed in elegant script that made my blood run cold. "Beautiful things for a beautiful woman. Happy birthday. A friend who admires you from afar." It wasn't my birthday, wouldn't be for another 6 months, which meant this wasn't an innocent mistake or a kind gesture from someone who'd gotten their dates confused, but rather a deliberate message designed to provoke a reaction, to test boundaries, to see what would happen when an unknown admirer sent gifts that Dante hadn't approved or vetted or interrogated me about until he was satisfied with my answers. I called him immediately, my hands shaking as I held the card, and he answered on the first ring as if he'd been waiting for this exact call, as if he'd somehow known that something was about to happen that would force this situation to its conclusion. "I just received flowers," I said without preamble, and I could hear him go absolutely still on the other end of the line, could sense the shift from whatever he'd been doing into complete focus on my words and their implications. "What kind of flowers? Who sent them? And what did the card say?" His voice was pure ice, controlled and deadly, and I could imagine him already mobilizing resources, already running through possibilities and threats and responses with the tactical precision that made him so dangerous in his world. I read him the card verbatim, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through my veins, despite the growing realization that this innocent-seeming gesture was actually something much more sinister, something that proved Dante's paranoia about threats and danger had been entirely justified all along. "Get away from your desk right now," he commanded, and I could hear him moving, could hear car doors slamming and engines starting in the background, could sense the entire machinery of his organization spinning into motion based on nothing more than a bouquet of flowers and an unsigned card. "Don't touch the flowers again. Don't let anyone else near them. And tell Marco to clear that entire section of the office immediately, because those roses aren't a romantic gesture from some shy admirer, but a message from Victor letting me know that he can reach you anywhere, that even surrounded by my security you're still vulnerable to his attention. And the fact that he knew to send them today of all days means he has someone inside my organization feeding him information about your schedule and your movements." The implications of what he was saying hit me like a physical blow. The understanding that this wasn't just about jealousy or possessiveness, but about a very real threat from people who meant genuine harm, who saw me as nothing more than a weapon to use against the man I'd been foolish enough to fall for. Within minutes, The auction house was swarming with Dante's security personnel, men in dark suits who cleared the floor with efficient brutality and examined the flower arrangement with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for bomb disposal. And I stood in the corner of my office watching this unfold with a sense of surreal detachment, as if I were observing someone else's life implode rather than my own. Dante arrived shortly after, striding through the chaos with single-minded purpose until he reached me and pulled me into his arms with a desperation that communicated more than words ever could. His face buried in my hair as he held me like I might disappear if he loosened his grip even slightly. "I'm so sorry," he whispered against my temple, his voice rough with an emotion that might have been fear or relief, or some combination that I couldn't parse in my current state of shock. "I'm sorry that knowing me has put you in this position. Sorry that loving me comes with dangers that you never asked for. Sorry that I can't just be a normal man who takes you to dinner and buys you flowers without every gesture carrying the weight of family wars and old vendettas and threats that most people only see in movies." "Were the flowers actually dangerous?" I asked, needing to know if his reaction had been purely precautionary, or if I'd been standing next to something that could have actually harmed me, needing to understand the true scope of what we were dealing with here. He pulled back just enough to look at me, and the expression on his face was pure fury, mixed with a protectiveness so fierce it made my breath catch, made me realize that whatever complicated thing existed between us had evolved far beyond casual involvement or convenient arrangement into territory that carried weight and consequence, and the potential for destruction on both sides. "The flowers themselves were clean," he said, his hands framing my face with that careful gentleness that always surprised me given his capacity for violence. "But the message was clear enough. Victor knows where you work, knows your schedule, knows that you matter enough to me that threatening you is worth his time and resources. And that means we need to make some decisions about how we're going to handle this, about what level of security you're comfortable with, and what adjustments we need to make to keep you safe without completely destroying your independence and autonomy in the process." He paused, his dark eyes searching mine with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. Impossible to pretend that this conversation wasn't about to determine the entire trajectory of our future together or apart. "But more importantly, I need to know if you still want this, if you want me, because I can protect you from Victor and his threats, can keep you safe from the physical dangers that come with being associated with my family. But I can't protect you from the emotional toll of living this life. Can't guarantee that there won't be more flowers and more messages, and more reminders that choosing me means choosing a world where violence is always just beneath the surface, waiting to erupt." I looked around my office, at the security personnel still processing the scene, at Marco and Stefano flanking the door with expressions that suggested they felt personally responsible for this breach, even though they'd done everything right, at Thomas hovering nervously in the hallway, clearly wondering what kind of insanity he'd stumbled into. And I realized that Dante was offering me an out, giving me permission to walk away before things got even more complicated and dangerous, before I became so entangled in his world that extraction would be impossible without casualties. The rational part of my brain, the part that had gotten me through graduate school and built a successful career and made sensible choices based on careful risk assessment, screamed that this was my chance to escape, to choose safety and normalcy, and a life that didn't involve security details and flower-based threats from rival Mafia families. But there was another part of me, a part that had come alive in the 3 months since Dante Salvatore had looked at me like I was a masterpiece he intended to acquire regardless of cost, that whispered something different entirely, that suggested maybe some things were worth the risk, worth the danger, worth stepping into darkness if it meant experiencing the kind of intensity and connection that most people only read about in novels. "I want you," I said finally, my voice steady despite the chaos surrounding us, despite the very valid reasons I should be running in the opposite direction, as fast as my legs could carry me. "I want you, even though you're possessive and controlling and have more issues than any human should reasonably be expected to work through. Even though being with you means accepting security details and threats from people who want to hurt you through me. even though every rational part of my brain is screaming that this is the worst possible decision I could make for my safety and peace of mind. The relief that flooded his expression was so profound, so genuine, that it transformed his entire face from the hard mask he showed the world into something vulnerable and almost boyish. And he kissed me with a reverence that felt like worship and a hunger that felt like desperation. And I kissed him back while security personnel pretended not to notice, and my career reputation probably took a hit that I'd have to deal with later, but in that moment couldn't bring myself to care about. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against mine in that gesture of intimacy that had become our signature, that moment of connection that felt more profound than any of the physical intimacy we'd shared. "Then we do this properly," he said, his voice rough with emotion and determination, and I could see him shifting into the strategic mindset that made him so effective in his role, could watch him already planning and calculating and figuring out how to navigate this situation in ways that would keep me safe while respecting my autonomy as much as possible. "You move into my penthouse where security is already established, and the building is controlled by people I trust. You let me assign a full protection detail that will accompany you everywhere until we've neutralized the Victor situation. And in return, I promise to be honest with you about threats and dangers rather than trying to shield you with selective information. I promise to explain my security decisions rather than just implementing them and expecting you to accept without question. And I promise to work on the jealousy and possessiveness that has nothing to do with legitimate threats, and everything to do with my own damage and inability to trust even when trust is earned." "That's a lot of promises from a man who interrogated me about my grandmother's bracelet less than a week ago," I said. But there was no heat in my words, just acknowledgement of how far we'd come, and how far we still had to go. Just recognition that we were both damaged and complicated, and probably terrible for each other, in ways that would become increasingly apparent as this relationship progressed. What happens if you can't keep those promises? What happens when your need to control everything collides with my need for independence? What happens when the security requirements start to feel like a cage rather than protection? "Then you tell me," he said simply, as if the solution were that straightforward, as if communication could solve problems that were rooted in trauma and fear, and the fundamental differences in how we'd been raised to view the world and relationships. "You tell me when I'm crossing lines? You call me out when I'm being unreasonable? You push back when the security feels oppressive rather than protective? And I promise to listen even when every instinct I have is screaming at me to tighten control rather than loosen it, even when trusting you feels like standing on the edge of a cliff waiting to fall." He cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs stroking over my cheekbones in that absent gesture of affection that suggested he needed the physical contact as much as I did, needed the reassurance that I was real and present, and choosing this despite everything. "I can't promise to be easy to love, Mira. Can't promise that my jealousy and possessiveness will disappear overnight just because I've made some declarations about doing better. But I can promise that you matter enough to me to try, to work on the damage that Valentina left behind, to build something with you that's based on actual trust rather than just surveillance and verification." "What you're describing sounds like an actual relationship," I said, unable to keep the wonder out of my voice, unable to hide how much this shift meant to me after months of undefined territory and emotional ambiguity, after wondering if I was just a convenient distraction or something more substantial that might actually have a future. Like something with commitment and partnership and actual emotional intimacy beyond just incredible physical chemistry and shared danger. Like something that might actually last beyond the next crisis, or threat, or moment when your paranoia convinces you that I'm secretly betraying you with imaginary rivals. "That's exactly what I'm describing," he confirmed, and the certainty in his voice made my heart do something complicated in my chest, made me realize that I'd been waiting for this without acknowledging how much I needed to hear him claim me properly, needed him to define what we were in terms that went beyond possession and control into territory that actually resembled love, even if neither of us was quite ready to use that word yet. "I'm claiming you, Mira Castellano, officially and completely, making it known to every person in my world and yours that you're mine and I'm yours, that we're building something together that matters enough to fight for, enough to take risks for, enough to work, through trauma and trust issues, and all the complicated damage we both carry from our respective pasts. And what happens now? I asked, acutely aware that we were still standing in my office surrounded by security personnel and evidence of Victor's message, that this wasn't exactly the romantic setting for the conversation we were having, that real life was going to intrude on this moment very soon, with logistics and security protocols, and all the practical considerations that came with choosing to stay with someone whose enemies sent threatening flower arrangements. What's the immediate plan for dealing with Victor and keeping me safe and figuring out who inside your organization is feeding him information about my movements? His expression darkened with barely controlled fury at the mention of the mole, and I saw the Mafia boss surface again, the man who ruled an empire through carefully calculated violence and unwavering loyalty expectations. I handle Victor the way my family has always handled threats to what we value, he said, and there was something absolutely terrifying in his tone, something that reminded me viscerally that Dante Salvatore was capable of brutality that I'd only seen hints of, that the protection he offered came with a cost measured in other people's suffering. I make it clear that touching you means declaring war on the entire Salvatore organization, that any further attempts to use you as leverage will be met with the kind of response that serves as a permanent deterrent to anyone else who might consider similar strategies. And I find the person who betrayed my trust by feeding information to my enemies, and I make an example that ensures no one else will make the same mistake. The cold certainty in his voice should have frightened me, should have made me reconsider this entire decision to stay with him. But instead I found myself feeling oddly safe, protected by the very violence that should repel me, drawn to the darkness in him that promised to destroy anyone who tried to hurt me, even as I recognized the moral complexity of being complicit in that kind of retaliation. I don't want to know the details, I said finally, establishing a boundary that I needed to maintain if I was going to stay sane in this relationship, if I was going to reconcile the man who held me with tenderness, with the man who could order violence without apparent remorse. I don't want to know what you do to Victor or the mole or anyone else who threatens us. Don't want to carry that knowledge or that responsibility, because I need to be able to look at you and see the person I'm falling for, rather than the crimes committed in my name. That's fair, he said, accepting my boundary with an ease that surprised me, that suggested maybe he'd been waiting for me to draw these lines, to establish what I could and couldn't handle about his world. You'll be protected from the details, insulated from the violence except what's absolutely necessary for your own safety, and I'll carry that weight so you don't have to. We'll be the monster when circumstances require it, so that you can maintain your humanity and your conscience and whatever part of yourself needs to believe that you're still fundamentally good despite choosing to love someone like me. Is that what this is? I asked, the question tumbling out before I could stop it, before I could consider whether I was ready to hear his answer, or whether some things were better left unspoken until they became undeniable through time and action, rather than premature declaration. Love, I mean, is that what we're doing here? Or are we just calling it partnership and protection and intense physical chemistry because the alternative is too terrifying to name out loud? He looked at me for a long moment, his dark eyes searching mine with that intensity that made me feel simultaneously exposed and cherished. And then he smiled, really smiled, in a way that I'd never seen before, something genuine and unguarded that transformed his entire face into something almost beautiful in its vulnerability. I've been in love with you since the night you argued with me about the attribution of a Caravaggio forgery and refused to back down even when I told you that you were wrong. Since the moment I realized that you had enough steel in your spine to stand up to me and enough intelligence to do it effectively. Since I understood that you were the first person in years who saw me as something other than a weapon or a wallet or a means to an end, he said, and the confession hit me like a physical impact, stealing my breath and making my heart race with emotions too big and complicated to process in this moment. So yes, Mira, this is love. Messy and complicated, and probably toxic in ways that a therapist would have a field day analyzing. But it's the only kind of love I'm capable of giving. And if you can accept it with all its sharp edges and dark corners and possessive intensity, then I'll spend the rest of my life proving that choosing me wasn't the worst decision you ever made, even though by every rational measure it probably is. I opened my mouth to respond, to tell him that I loved him too, despite every reason I shouldn't. Despite the security details, and the threats, and the interrogations and the complicated darkness that came with his territory. But before I could form the words, Marco appeared in the doorway, with an expression that suggested whatever news he was bringing would shatter this fragile moment of connection we'd managed to create in the midst of chaos. "Sir," he said, his voice urgent and apologetic, "we've identified the source of the leak, and you're going to want to handle this personally, because it's not just some low-level operative selling information. It's someone from your inner circle, someone you trusted with access to your personal life and security protocols. And when you find out who it is, this entire situation is going to get significantly more complicated in ways that will affect everyone in your organization, including Miss Castellanos' safety moving forward." The necklace wasn't a gift at all, but rather a declaration of war. And Dante's reaction when the small black box appeared on my desk at the auction house 3 days after we'd identified the mole in his organization proved that I'd stepped irrevocably into a world where love and death danced on the same razor's edge, where every gesture carried weight that extended far beyond its surface, meaning into territory mapped by violence and revenge, and the kind of strategic thinking that treated human relationships as nothing more than pieces on a chessboard to be sacrificed when circumstances demanded it. The box itself was unremarkable. Simple black velvet with no card or identification. But the moment I opened it and saw the blood-red ruby pendant nestled against white satin, something in my gut twisted with the certain knowledge that this wasn't romance, but rather a threat wrapped in the trappings of affection. A message from someone who understood exactly how to weaponize the language of gifts that Dante had been so obsessed with interrogating and cataloging and verifying since the night he'd seen my grandmother's bracelet at the gala. I called him immediately, my hands trembling as I held the box at arm's length like it might explode or release some kind of poison gas, and he answered before the first ring had finished, his voice already tight with tension, as if he'd been waiting for this exact call. As if he'd somehow known that Victor Constantine wasn't finished playing games with us despite the brutal response Dante had delivered after the flower incident. "Don't touch it. Don't move from where you are. And tell Marco to lock down the entire floor, because that necklace is from Victor. And it means he's escalating his strategy from subtle intimidation to open provocation. Means he's done testing our defenses and is ready to make his actual move against you, against us, against everything I've built to keep you safe in a world that sees you as nothing more than my most obvious vulnerability," Dante said in a rush. And I could hear him already mobilizing, could hear the controlled chaos in the background as his organization responded to a threat that I was only beginning to understand in its full scope and terrible implications. Within 20 minutes, the auction house was once again swarming with security personnel. But this time the atmosphere was different, charged with barely suppressed violence and the kind of grim determination that suggested we'd crossed some invisible line from defensive posture into active warfare. And I watched from my office as Dante strode through the gallery, with an expression so cold and dangerous that even his own men seemed to shrink from his path, seemed to understand that the carefully controlled Mafia boss had given way to something more primal and infinitely more lethal. He took the box from my desk without looking at it, handed it to one of his men with instructions I couldn't hear, and then pulled me into his arms with a desperation that communicated more than words ever could. His face buried in my hair as he breathed me in like he was reassuring himself that I was still alive, still whole, still untouched by the violence that was clearly coming for us both, whether we wanted it or not. "The mole was Elena," he said against my temple, his voice rough with a betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound could have. And I felt my entire world tilt sideways with the revelation, because Elena had been with his family for decades, had been the one person I thought was beyond suspicion, had seemed genuinely concerned for my well-being when she'd warned me about Dante's state of mind that morning in his office. She's been feeding Victor information for 6 months, ever since he approached her with proof that her grandson was dealing drugs in Constantine territory, and offered to make his legal problems disappear in exchange for intelligence about my operations, about my schedule, about the people in my life who might serve as leverage if he needed to apply pressure at exactly the right moment to cause maximum damage. And the pain in his voice as he recounted this betrayal made my heart ache for him, made me understand in visceral detail how deeply Valentina's original betrayal had wounded him, how every subsequent act of disloyalty carved the scars deeper and reinforced his belief that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford in his world. "What did you do to her?" I asked, needing to know even though I'd established boundaries about not wanting details of his violence, needing to understand what kind of man I'd committed myself to loving, what he was capable of when someone he'd trusted turned against him in ways that threatened not just his empire but the people he cared about most. He pulled back just enough to look at me, and the expression on his face was complicated, layered with regret and resignation, and a hardness that suggested he'd made peace with the darker aspects of his nature, long before I'd come into his life to complicate his carefully constructed emotional defenses. "I gave her a choice that was more mercy than she deserved," he said, his hands framing my face with that gentle possessiveness that had become familiar, that made me feel simultaneously cherished and owned in ways I was still learning to navigate. She could face my justice, which would have been swift and final, and would have served as the kind of example that prevents future betrayals, or she could disappear, take her grandson and whatever money she'd managed to save and leave the city permanently, never to return or contact anyone from her old life again. And in exchange, I would let Victor believe that I'd dealt with her in the traditional way, would maintain the fiction that betraying me carries the ultimate price even when I choose mercy over vengeance. He paused, searching my eyes for judgment or condemnation, or perhaps just understanding of the impossible position he occupied, the constant balancing act between the violence expected of him and the humanity he tried to preserve despite everything his world demanded. "She took the second option," he continued, his thumb stroking over my cheekbone in that absent gesture of affection that grounded us both. "Left last night with her grandson, and enough money to start over somewhere far from the reach of both families. And I let her go because you make me want to be better than what this life has made me. Make me want to find alternatives to the brutal simplicity of violence even when violence would be easier and more effective, and more in line with what's expected of someone in my position." The confession hung between us, weighted with implications about how much I'd already changed him, about whether love could genuinely reform someone shaped by generations of organized crime, or whether we were both just fooling ourselves into believing that redemption was possible for a man with so much blood on his hands. "The necklace is his response to Elena's disappearance," I said, understanding clicking into place with sickening clarity, understanding that Victor had sent the ruby pendant not as a random threat, but as a specific message about consequences and escalation, about what happened when Dante chose mercy over the brutal justice that their world expected. "He's telling you that showing weakness, even kindness disguised as tactical decision-making, will be punished, that letting Elena live was a mistake that he intends to exploit, that I'm going to pay the price for your moment of humanity because in his mind that's poetic justice, making you regret the choice to be merciful by using it against the person who inspired that mercy in the first place." "Yes," Dante confirmed, and the single word carried so much weight, so much fury barely held in check, that I could practically feel the violence coiling in him like a spring wound too tight, ready to explode outward at the slightest provocation. "Which is why we're not waiting for him to make his next move. Why we're not playing defense anymore and letting him dictate the terms of this engagement. Why I'm going to do what I should have done the moment he sent those flowers, and end this threat permanently, before he has another opportunity to touch you, or threaten you, or send you jewelry, that's meant to remind us both that no amount of security can completely protect you from someone determined enough to cause harm." His voice had gone cold with determination, and I recognized the shift happening in real time. The transformation from the complicated man I loved into the ruthless Mafia boss who had survived and thrived in a world that destroyed weaker men. And some part of me mourned the necessity of that transformation, even as I understood that this was who he'd always been, that the tenderness he showed me was the exception, rather than the rule in a life defined by strategic violence. "What are you planning?" I asked, fear creeping into my voice despite my best efforts to remain calm, despite my understanding that this was inevitable from the moment I'd chosen to stay with him after the flower incident. From the moment I'd acknowledged that loving Dante Salvatore meant accepting all of him, including the parts that terrified me and challenged every moral principle I'd been raised to value. "What are you going to do to Victor? And what role am I supposed to play in whatever strategy you're developing? Because I refuse to be just a passive victim waiting to be rescued. Refuse to sit safely in your penthouse while you wage war on my behalf, without any input or agency in decisions that will determine whether I live or die, or end up as collateral damage in conflicts that started before I was even born?" His expression shifted at my words, surprise flickering across his features, before being replaced by something that looked almost like pride, like respect for the steel in my spine that had attracted him in the first place. And he kissed me hard and fast before pulling back with a smile that was all dangerous edges and predatory intent. "Then you're going to help me set a trap," he said, and the certainty in his voice suggested he'd already been planning this, had already factored my involvement into whatever strategy he was developing to end Victor's threat once and for all. "You're going to use your art world connections and your reputation for authenticity to create an auction that Victor won't be able to resist. A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to acquire a piece so valuable and rare that he'll have to surface personally to bid on it. And when he does, when he steps into territory thinking he's untouchable because it's a public event with witnesses and rules and the veneer of civilization, that's when we'll show him that some rules only apply to people who aren't willing to burn the whole world down to protect what's theirs. They say the Mafia doesn't do happy endings, that people like Dante and me are destined to burn out in spectacular fashion, rather than fade gently into anything resembling domestic tranquility. But as I stood in the ruins of the Salvatore auction house with plaster dust coating my emerald gown and Dante's blood staining my hands from where I'd pressed them against the bullet graze on his shoulder, I realized with startling clarity that we were writing our own rules about what constituted survival and victory, and the kind of love that emerges from darkness rather than dissolving in its presence. The auction had gone exactly according to plan, right up until the moment Victor's men had opened fire, transforming my carefully curated exhibition of Renaissance masterworks into a war zone where priceless art became collateral damage, and the veneer of civilization shattered under the weight of violence that had been building for decades between families who'd forgotten how to resolve conflicts through anything other than bloodshed and strategic brutality. Victor himself lay dead 3 rooms away, brought down not by Dante's bullets, but by my quick thinking when I'd grabbed a centuries-old bronze sculpture and brought it down on his head as he'd aimed his weapon at Dante's back. And the look of absolute shock on the Russian mobster's face in that final moment would probably haunt my dreams for years to come, even as it filled me with a savage satisfaction that I hadn't known I was capable of feeling until someone I loved was threatened with immediate death. Dante had stared at me in the aftermath, with an expression that cycled through horror and pride and something that looked heartbreakingly like gratitude. And then he'd pulled me into his arms, despite the pain from his wound, and kissed me with a desperation that tasted like relief and terror, and the understanding that we'd both crossed lines tonight that would fundamentally change who we were and what we could pretend to be in the comfortable fiction we'd been maintaining about my relationship to his world. "You saved my life," he said now, his voice rough with emotion and shock and the adrenaline crash that was starting to hit us both as the immediate danger receded and reality reasserted itself in the form of sirens approaching and his security personnel securing the scene and the terrible knowledge that we'd have to explain all of this to authorities who would ask questions we couldn't fully answer without revealing truths that needed to remain buried. "You killed a man to protect me," crossed a line that I never wanted you to cross, became complicit in violence that I've spent months trying to shield you from. And I don't know whether to be grateful that you're the kind of woman who can do what's necessary in a crisis, or devastated that loving me has turned you into someone capable of taking a life without hesitation when circumstances demand it. I'm both, I admitted, looking down at my trembling hands and the blood drying there. Victor's blood mixed with Dante's in a macabre testament to the night's events, and I felt tears finally break through the shock that had been holding them back. Felt the enormity of what I'd done crash over me in waves that threatened to pull me under. I'm grateful that I had the strength and the presence of mind to act when it mattered most. Grateful that you're alive, and that Victor can't threaten us anymore. But I'm also terrified of how easy it was. How little I hesitated when I saw him aiming at you. How my first and only thought was that I couldn't lose you, even if saving you meant damning myself in ways I don't fully understand yet, and probably won't for a very long time. The confession poured out of me in a rush. All the complicated emotions that came with discovering you're capable of violence when someone you love is in danger. With understanding that there's a darkness in everyone that just needs the right circumstances to surface and transform you into someone you don't entirely recognize. Dante cupped my face with his uninjured hand, forcing me to meet his eyes. And what I saw there was understanding and acceptance and a love so fierce it made my breath catch, despite everything that had just happened. Despite the bodies and the destruction and the sirens getting closer with every passing second. Then we carry it together? He said simply, as if the solution were that straightforward. As if sharing the weight of what we'd both done tonight could somehow make it more bearable than facing it alone. We carry the knowledge of what we're capable of. We live with the choices we made to protect each other, and we build something worth all of this sacrifice and darkness and moral compromise. Because if we don't, if we let the violence define us rather than using it as foundation for something better, then Victor wins even in death, and everything we've been through becomes meaningless suffering rather than the price we paid for a chance at genuine happiness. 6 months later, I stood in front of a mirror in Dante's private chapel, adjusting the simple white dress I'd chosen for our wedding. So different from the elaborate gown I'd once imagined wearing if I ever got married. So perfectly appropriate for a ceremony that would be witnessed by only a handful of people who understood what we'd survived to get here, what we'd sacrificed and compromised, and fundamentally changed about ourselves in the process of choosing each other, despite every rational reason we shouldn't. The investigation into the auction house shooting had concluded exactly as Dante had predicted it would, with Victor's death ruled as self-defense, and the violence attributed to a rivalry between criminal organizations that had finally boiled over into public confrontation, and my role in Victor's death had been quietly buried under layers of witness testimony from Dante's people who'd sworn I'd been nowhere near the actual confrontation when it happened. Dante appeared in the doorway of the small room where I was preparing, devastatingly handsome in a perfectly tailored black suit that somehow made him look both civilized and dangerous in equal measure. And he crossed to me with that predatory grace that still made my heart race, even after all these months of living together and learning each other's patterns and building something that resembled an actual partnership despite all the complications inherent in loving someone from his world. "Who bought you that bracelet?" he asked, with a slight smile playing at his lips, gesturing to my wrist where my grandmother's platinum and diamond bracelet caught the afternoon light streaming through the stained glass windows, and I recognized the callback to the night this had all started, to the question that had triggered everything that followed, including the interrogations, and the revelations and the violence that had ultimately brought us to this moment. "A man who interrogates me about jewelry, but would burn the world down to keep me safe," I replied, using the response I'd been planning for months, ever since Dante had proposed with a simple silver band engraved with La Mia Anima, and a promise that he would spend the rest of his life proving that choosing him hadn't been the catastrophic mistake every rational part of my brain had screamed it would be. A man who is so damaged and possessive and fundamentally broken in ways that would terrify most people, but who loves me with an intensity that makes all of that worthwhile. who has shown me that darkness isn't something to run from, but rather something to walk through hand in hand with someone brave enough to face it alongside you. "Damn right I would," he said, closing the distance between us, and pulling me into his arms with a tenderness that still surprised me sometimes, that reminded me that beneath all the violence and control and strategic brutality was a man capable of profound gentleness when circumstances allowed it, when he felt safe enough to lower his defenses and show me the parts of himself that he'd hidden from the world for so long. "And I'll spend every day of our marriage making sure you never regret taking this leap with me, making sure that the life we build together is worth every sacrifice and moral compromise and moment of fear that brought us here, making sure that when you look back on the night you killed a man to save my life, you see it not as the moment you lost yourself, but as the moment you proved that love sometimes requires us to become more than we thought we were capable of being." We stood there in the quiet of the chapel, surrounded by centuries of history and the ghosts of everyone who'd made impossible choices in the name of love before us. And I realized that this was our happy ending, even if it looked nothing like what I'd once imagined happiness would feel like, even if it came wrapped in complexity and moral ambiguity, and the certain knowledge that our future would involve navigating darkness that most people only encountered in nightmares. The bracelet on my wrist caught the light as Dante lifted my hand to his lips, kissing my knuckles with a reverence that made my heart ache with emotions too big to name. And I thought about my grandmother and the 53 years she'd spent with a man who loved her completely. And I understood finally what she'd been trying to tell me when she'd given me this bracelet and told me stories about devotion that survived everything life threw at it. "Ready to become Mrs. Salvatore?" Dante asked. And there was vulnerability beneath the question. A genuine uncertainty about whether I might still change my mind and choose safety over this beautiful, terrifying thing we were building together, in defiance of everything that suggested we were doomed to fail. "Ready to officially bind yourself to a man whose gifts come with interrogations, and whose love comes with security details, and whose world will always carry shadows that threaten to consume everything they touch, including the people foolish enough or brave enough to choose us despite knowing better?" "More ready than I've ever been for anything," I answered honestly, and I meant it with every fiber of my being, despite the fear and the uncertainty, and the knowledge that we were stepping into a future that promised equal parts devotion and danger. Because some loves are worth fighting for, even when the fight requires becoming someone you never thought you'd be. Even when happiness looks like standing in ruins with blood on your hands and choosing to build something beautiful from the wreckage anyway. Even when the only gift that truly matters is the terrifying, exhilarating, absolutely irreplaceable gift of being seen and chosen and loved completely by someone who understands that darkness is just another country you can learn to navigate together if you're willing to hold on tight enough and trust that the light you create between you is strong enough to guide you home.